The Vikings invaded the southwest towards the end of the 8th century. Now, in the 9th century, there seems to have been some sort of disruption in the settlement here at Trowbridge, and it's possible that the Anglo-Saxon settlement here was disrupted in some way by Viking attacks and the impacts of the Vikings on the economy in the West Country. But we can't be certain about that. It might have happened just because of problems in the economy. But back to the Vikings. In about 789, the very first Viking raid took place on Portland in Dorset, so the West Country features in the earliest Viking attacks. These first Vikings came from Norway, according to the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, although most of the Vikings who later attacked the West Country seem to have been Danish Vikings. And by Vikings we mean pirates, adventurers who'd set out from what we now call Scandinavia, from places like Norway and Denmark, later on from Sweden as well, attacking Anglo-Saxon England, raiding, slave-taking, and eventually settling. From about the 830s, we see attacks on Somerset. Now, these Vikings seem to have come from Ireland, where the Vikings had established bases around Dublin, and then they'd established bases in the Bristol Channel, at places like Flatholm and Steepholm, which are Viking names. In fact, Fleetholm means the place where you might keep your fleet. Viking fleet of raiders, for example. So we know there were raids on Somerset and on Devon too from the 830s onwards. This tended to change dramatically in 851. In 851, the very first Viking army stayed over the winter. Until this time, Viking armies had gone home over the winter, but in 851, they stayed in Kent, in Thanet, and they began to settle and seize Anglo-Saxon land. This accelerated, became even worse in 866 when a really large Viking army, which the Anglo-Saxons called the Mickle Heathen Hera, which means the Great Heathen Army, landed in East Anglia and proceeded to conquer and take over the kingdom of Northumbria, the kingdom of East Anglia. They killed the Anglo-Saxon kings of these kingdoms, the kingdom of Mercia, and they drove the king of Mercia, Burgred, from his throne, until in the end, by the 870s, the only Anglo-Saxon kingdom left was Wessex. But it would be wrong to think the Vikings only brought destruction, because clearly whilst they did bring a lot of destruction and a lot of problems, a lot of disruption, they also were traders, and they would have connected Anglo-Saxon England up, once they'd taken over areas, with a wide trading network. The Vikings got as far as Iceland, they got as far as Greenland, North America, they raided into Russia, they made it into the Eastern Mediterranean. And when we find coin hoards, groups of coins buried in the ground from the Viking period, we sometimes find there are coins with Islamic writing on them from the Eastern Mediterranean. There are coins from what we now call France. There are coins from other Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. So once the disruption was over, those areas that the Vikings had taken over were actually now linked up, plugged in, if you like, to an even bigger trading network than before, and there would have been benefits from that as well. But the key thing to remember is the one kingdom that wasn't conquered by the Vikings was Wessex. And so Wessex wouldn't have had the same amount of Scandinavian, Norse-speaking settlement as, for example, in the Eastern Midlands or East Anglia or Northumbria in what we now call Yorkshire.